The number one thing you can do to improve your productivity as a software developer is to write tests against your software. I gave a speech recently at Curiosum's Elixir meetup on LinkedIn. Thank you, Curiosum, for hosting me. And the topic was how testing and refactoring can improve your productivity as a developer. At the end of the presentation, the Q&A portion was bomb. Questions like, what if your boss or your customer doesn't want you writing tests? How much test coverage should we go for? Should we go aiming for 100% test coverage? How do we handle interactions with third-party APIs like Amazon S3 or Google Cloud? And how do you handle the learning curve when you're learning how to write tests and it slows you down? You will find the answers to all these questions in Software Sophistication number 2, all about testing. Let's get into it.
Next question from Bjorn, which is, how do you handle a customer who sees tests as a waste of time and don't want to pay for that waste of time? That's an excellent question. In that situation, so that most of the time you're dealing, at least for me, I'm dealing with non-technical stakeholders, so they don't know. So you just write them anyway. But if you do have a customer who sees them as a waste of time, personally, I would say you should try and find someone else to do this. Most of the world doesn't write tests. Testing are like, remember my seeing eye dog example? Like, I'm so dogmatic at this point in my career, I don't know how to write code without tests. Like, I don't know how. I won't do it. I can't. Like, because what tests do, they give me the confidence to know that my stuff works. Essentially, that is a customer that's not for me. Essentially, I would put my foot down in that situation. Milan asked also a really good question. I'm going to get to Tomas's. Let's do Milan's first. Are you trying to have 100% test coverage? That is also an excellent question. That is not the goal. The reason why is because the law of diminishing returns. Let's say you're eating at all you can eat. You're eating an all you can eat at a Chinese buffet or something. That's very popular in the United States. You get diminishing returns on your value of an all you can eat because when you go, you're very hungry. You're just eating. You eat one plate, two plates. That third plate, you may want to consider getting half a plate of food because you're probably not going to eat that entire third plate. That's the law of diminishing returns because you've had all you can eat, which means theoretically you could eat forever. But you have diminishing returns because you only have so much capacity to consume that food and digest it. So in terms of test coverage, I've discovered that code bases reach a level of about diminishing returns around 95% test coverage. Because at that point, from that last 5%, you're usually having to do very difficult test setup, or you end up with what's called flaky tests that fail sometimes to achieve that last 5%. So I would say that what I would aim for most organizations is to achieve on a baseline 80% test coverage. A good level of test coverage is 90%. And then I would never try and go for 100% test coverage because it's not going to be worth it, essentially. Testing, you get just diminishing returns on your effort if you start nearing 100% test coverage. Tomas asks, we have a project that touches multiple code bases. We have a project that touches you implement an API where one code base is the client and the other is the server. That's also, man, you guys are killing it with these questions. So with that, we use what's considered black box style testing. So like say you need to upload an image to Amazon S3. The concept that you would use for this is to create a mock of the API response. Because if you're having to spin up two applications, you're going to introduce latency in your test suite by having two processes that are running on your computer, or one sending a request and one's responding, and then it's what you want to do is you want to test up into the boundary of your system, up until, like say the Amazon S3 example. You want to test up until the point where your API call is going to Amazon S3, and then you may want to test against when Amazon S3 returns a successful response or returns a failure response. So in your example, client server, I'd have tests for my client that has a mocked out API, a very simple version of the real API, and I would test the client. And on the server side, the server side that's what's serving it up. So you don't need to do any mocking or stubbing. So essentially, instead of, and I've tried to do this where I've tried to spin up the client and the server, I would not suggest it. It's not worth it. you want to use the concepts of stubbing and mocking external services. That's the concept of when you're trying to test multiple systems. And then you may want to write what's called a smoke test. Like just right when you're going to deploy to production, just a very simple, like, do these two things talk to each other? But most of the time, you're going to just be mocking and stubbing. Let's
Let me also add something to it. There's also something like in Elixir, for instance, VCR cassettes, where you can actually record what's being returned from instance of the server. You can also try to use this kind of things because it tends to give you a better real data. Yeah, this is just another approach.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, so that's an excellent, that's an additional alternative to mocking and stubbing that is very powerful. It's a form of mocking and stubbing that, like essentially Simon was saying, is very realistic. All right, last one. Any tips on how to tackle the learning curve of a test framework and technique? I asked that because I experienced colleagues and even myself dropped. Yes. So this is the standard practice, right, Gabriel? This is the reason why most of the field doesn't write tests, because it's like, oh, it's taking me more time to do it. So in this situation where you're dropping it to go faster, I would use, as a consultant, we use the concept of a time box where we give ourselves 2 hours, 1 hour, 30 minutes to work on something. And then if you need to write it without tests, you do it. But essentially, like, that was the end of my presentation when I talked about like the advantage of, like, expect to be slower. You're struggling with the testing framework and learning about testing because you haven't done it before. It's just like when you learned how to code in general. It does have a learning curve. So what I'm trying to convince you with this presentation is that on the other side of that is bliss. It's knowing that your stuff works, giving you the ability to refactor safely and with confidence. So if you're at that point now, just give yourself grace. Start writing a few tests. Just do unit tests. You have to work with what you have, right? Like, you have to work within the framework of the organization that you're in. So write tests sometimes and just start gradually getting into it. But the key is to not drop it in its entirety, because then you're like the industry at large. You don't want to pay people like me to come in and clean up your code base. If you write tests, you'll never have to employ someone like me.